Hatred often thrives in the shadows, but in a small, unassuming town, it dared to show its face in broad daylight. What began as a group of gang members storming a beloved local cafe, a space that had become a haven for the town's minorities, would ignite a chain of events no one could have foreseen. The gang's goal was clear: intimidation and control. What they didn't count on was the quiet resolve of Claire Matthews, the woman they presumed to be just another helpless single mother. To the gang, Claire seemed like an easy target, a woman running a small business. No backup, no visible defenses. They couldn't have known that beneath her calm exterior was a former Navy SEAL, a woman whose past had honed her into a force of unrelenting determination and strategic brilliance. Before the gang realized their mistake, their reign of fear would unravel. Operations that had terrorized the community for years would be exposed, their influence shattered, and their leader brought to justice. But this isn't just a story of one woman fighting back. It's a story of a town reclaiming its safety, of a mother protecting her daughter's future, and of how courage in the face of hate can inspire a community to rise. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the cozy cafe as Claire Matthews worked behind the counter, her hands moving with practiced ease. The cafe, affectionately named Lila's Place after her 8-year-old daughter, had become a cornerstone of the community, a haven for anyone needing a kind word, a hot drink, or simply a place where they felt they belonged. The bell above the door chimed softly, signaling the arrival of another customer. Claire looked up, smiling warmly as Mrs. Gupta entered, her arms laden with books from the library down the street. "Good morning, Mrs. Gupta. Let me help you with those." "Ah, thank you, dear," Mrs. Gupta said, her voice warm. "You always make this old woman's day brighter," Claire chuckled, taking the stack of books and setting them gently on a nearby table. Moments like this, small, kind interactions, made all the hard work worth it. For Claire, the cafe wasn't just a business. It was her way of giving back, of creating a sanctuary in a town that had seen its share of unrest. The small town had always been a patchwork of cultures and histories, but in recent years, tension had been simmering beneath the surface. Claire's cafe stood as a quiet rebellion against that divide, welcoming everyone with open doors and a judgment-free atmosphere. People from all walks of life gathered there, a teacher grading papers, a pair of construction workers sharing jokes, a young artist sketching by the window. Each visitor brought a piece of themselves, weaving new stories into the cafe's walls. Claire loved the harmony that emerged when strangers connected over a cup of coffee or a slice of her famous blueberry pie. To her, Lila's Place was more than just a cafe. It was a promise to her daughter and the town that kindness and connection could heal even the deepest divides. As Claire returned to the counter, her gaze drifted to the framed photo sitting near the register. It was of Lila, beaming in a bright pink dress, her curls bouncing in the wind. The image anchored Claire, reminding her why she had left behind a dangerous life in the Navy SEALs for the quiet, albeit challenging, role of a single mother. But even in this tranquil moment, Claire's instincts caught on to something. Her sharp eyes, trained by years of military service, picked up on the faint remnants of graffiti scrawled on the cafe's side window. Though partially scrubbed away, the hateful message was unmistakable. A flicker of unease passed through her, but she quickly pushed it down. This wasn't the first time the cafe had been targeted. She'd always cleaned up the mess and moved on. Yet today, something felt different. Through the window, she noticed them. 3 men loitering across the street. They were too casual, too deliberate in the way they leaned against the wall, their eyes shifting toward the cafe. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head, caught her gaze and held it for a moment too long before smirking. Claire's stomach tightened. The bell above the door chimed again, and she turned, expecting another friendly face. Instead, the men walked in, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. They spread out, scanning the room like predators sizing up their prey. Conversations in the cafe faltered. a tense silence settling over the once bustling space. Claire's hand instinctively brushed the edge of the counter where her phone rested, her pulse steady but alert. She plastered on her warmest smile, but her eyes were already assessing the situation. She noted their stances, the subtle bulges under their jackets, details only someone with her training would catch. "Welcome," she said evenly, her voice calm. "What can I get you?" The tall man stepped forward, his smirk deepening as he glanced around the cafe. "Nice place you got here," he said, his tone carrying an edge that didn't match the words. His gaze swept across the room, lingering on the patrons who now avoided eye contact. Claire held his stare, refusing to let him see even a flicker of doubt. "Thank you," she replied smoothly. "Can I get you something to drink or eat?" The man chuckled, leaning against the counter as if testing her patience. "We're just here to look around," he said, his smirk widening. His companions exchanged knowing glances, their presence heavy and intrusive. Claire's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but she kept her tone light. "Feel free. Let me know if you need anything." Her fingers itched to grab her phone, but she knew better than to escalate. She needed to de-escalate. For her customers, for Lila, for the cafe that had become more than just a business. The tension thickened, but Claire stood her ground, her calm demeanor masking the readiness of a warrior. Claire didn't flinch, but her grip tightened imperceptibly on the countertop. Outside the cafe, the late morning sun seemed to dim just a little, casting the room in muted shadows. And just like that, the air shifted. The tall man's smirk widened as he sauntered to the counter, his boots dragging against the wooden floor like a slow, deliberate threat. His two companions trailed behind him, one leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, while the other idly dragged his fingers across the backs of chairs, leaving a trail of discomfort in his wake. The usual hum of conversation in the cafe faded to silence, the few remaining customers exchanging uneasy glances. Claire Matthews stood behind the counter, her calm gaze fixed on the man approaching. She straightened slightly, her demeanor steady and unshaken, exuding a quiet authority that didn't need to be announced. "You got a name for this place?" the tall man asked, glancing around the room. "Or are we supposed to call it the neighborhood petting zoo?" He grinned at his own joke, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the cafe, drawing a few nervous chuckles from his companions. Claire didn't flinch. "It's called Lila's Place," she replied evenly, her tone calm but firm. "Welcome. The coffee's fresh if you're interested." The man paused, his grin sharpening like the edge of a blade. "Lila's Place, huh? Cute name. Lila yours?" "She is," Claire said, her voice steady, though her hand drifted slightly closer to the counter where her phone sat. Her calm tone didn't betray the tension simmering beneath the surface, but her eyes stayed locked on his, unwavering. "Well, ain't that sweet?" the tall man said, his grin spreading wider as he leaned against the counter, his body language dripping with casual arrogance. The words rolled off his tongue slowly, deliberately, each one laced with mockery. "You got a nice setup here. Real warm and fuzzy. I gotta say, though, it's not exactly what I'd expect to see in a town like this." His voice carried just loud enough to fill the space, the underlying edge making the friendly tone feel hollow. One of the men by the wall let out a snicker, sharp and derisive, his gaze sweeping across the room with deliberate laziness, like he was appraising the space and its occupants. His eyes lingered on the mismatched furniture, the eclectic decor that gave the cafe its charm, and finally, the patrons sitting uneasily in their chairs. "Yeah, it's got that diverse feel, doesn't it? Like someone's trying a little too hard to make a statement." His words hung in the air, heavy and pointed, the sneer in his tone unmistakable. Claire's jaw tightened ever so slightly, the smallest hint of tension breaking her otherwise calm expression. Her voice, however, remained steady, measured, and unwavering. "Everyone's welcome here," she said, her tone carrying a quiet authority that demanded respect. She nodded toward the chalkboard menu mounted on the wall. "If you're here to order, the menu's up there. If not, I'll have to ask you to leave." The man near the chairs smirked as he reached for one, dragging it noisily across the floor, the grating sound making several heads in the cafe turn. He dropped into the seat with a loud creak, leaning back casually, his arms crossing over his chest. "Leave? We just got here," he said, his mock-innocent tone practically dripping with condescension. "Seems kinda rude, don't you think?" The tall man straightened slightly, his smirk fading into something colder, sharper. His eyes narrowed as he studied Claire, his demeanor shifting from casual to menacing in the blink of an eye. "She's just being cautious, is all," he said, his voice quieter, but no less cutting. He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the nervous customers before returning to Claire. "See, a place like this? It's fragile. All these happy faces, people coming and going. It only takes one bad day for it all to come crashing down." Claire's fingers curled slightly, tightening against the edge of the counter, but her expression remained steady, her sharp gaze fixed on the man. "Is that a threat?" she asked, her voice cool and sharp, the words cutting through the tension like a knife. The man laughed, the sound devoid of warmth. He shook his head slowly, almost mockingly, as if humored by the question. "No threats," he said, his grin returning but darker now, the menace in his expression barely concealed. "Just a little friendly advice. You see, we've been keeping an eye on this town, and places like this, they need friends. People who can make sure nothing bad happens." "You mean protection," Claire said flatly, her voice firm and unyielding, refusing to play into his game. "Exactly," the man said, spreading his arms wide in a mock show of generosity. "We look out for our own. All we ask is a little something in return. You help us, we help you. It's a win-win." Claire didn't blink, her eyes locked onto his with a calm resolve that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. "I've been running this cafe just fine on my own," she said, her tone deliberate, each word laced with quiet defiance. "I don't need your kind of help." The man's grin twisted into something more sinister, his gaze narrowing as he leaned slightly closer to the counter. "No, not yet," he said slowly, his voice dropping just enough to make the words feel heavier. "But trust me, you will." The man sitting in the chair let out a low chuckle, the sound grating and full of malice. He leaned back farther in his seat, balancing precariously on the rear legs as he gestured toward the room with an exaggerated wave of his hand. "You'd be surprised how fast things can change," he said, his tone conversational but with a chilling undercurrent. "All it takes is one rock through the window, one fire in the kitchen, and suddenly, you're wishing you had someone to call." Claire's eyes flicked toward the few remaining customers, her sharp instincts taking in every detail of the tension in the room. Mrs. Gupta, seated near the window, clutched her handbag tightly against her chest, her knuckles white as she stared down at the table, pretending not to notice the men. A young couple in the corner exchanged nervous glances, their once animated conversation silenced, their half-finished cups of coffee now ignored. The soft hum of the cafe's usual life had been replaced by a suffocating stillness, broken only by the faint scrape of a chair or the occasional creak of the wooden floor. "Why don't you leave them out of this?" Claire said, her voice sharp now, cutting through the oppressive silence. There was no fear in her tone, only a steady edge that carried the weight of both warning and command. "Oh, don't worry," the tall man replied smoothly, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, his smirk still firmly in place. "We're not here for them. We're here for you. Just making sure you understand how things work around here." His words were casual on the surface, but the implied threat beneath them was unmistakable, hanging heavy in the air. The man lounging in the chair across the room chuckled, the sound low and grating as he kicked his feet up onto a nearby table, his dirty boots leaving scuff marks on its polished surface. He grinned, a smug expression that only added to the unease radiating through the room. "She doesn't get it yet," he said, leaning back farther in his seat as though he owned the place. "Give her a little time, though. She'll come around." The tall man, red, as Claire now recognized him from scraps of overheard town gossip, stepped closer to the counter, his movements slow and deliberate, designed to intimidate. He lowered his voice just enough to make the words more personal, more threatening. "We'll give you some time to think about it," he said, his tone as smooth as it was chilling. "But don't take too long. Things happen fast around here." Claire's heart pounded steadily beneath her calm exterior, each beat deliberate and controlled, a rhythm she knew well from years of keeping herself grounded under pressure. "You've made your point," she said, her voice steady and firm, though the tension in the air felt almost suffocating. "Now, unless you're ordering, I think it's time for you to leave." Red leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as a slow, chilling grin crept back across his face. "You don't get to tell me what to do, lady," he said, his voice low and sharp, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. The cafe seemed to shrink around them, the warm and welcoming atmosphere replaced by a stifling sense of unease. The faint creak of a chair or the hesitant shuffle of a customer only amplified the weight of the moment. Claire straightened her posture, her shoulders square, her calm and resolute demeanor unshaken, despite the mounting tension. "This is my cafe," she said evenly, her words measured but unyielding, "and I'm asking you to leave." Red's smirk faltered, replaced by a cold, hard stare. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. Behind him, his men shifted their weight, exchanging glances as the mood grew heavier, the subtle movements adding to the charged atmosphere. "I don't think you understand," Red said at last, his tone quiet but dripping with menace, each word deliberate and calculated. "We're not going anywhere." He tapped his knuckles rhythmically against the counter, the sharp, hollow sound breaking the quiet in the room and drawing even more attention to the confrontation. His cold, piercing gaze swept deliberately across the room, lingering on the uneasy customers before returning to Claire. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his tone light but steeped in thinly veiled threat. "But guts don't mean much when you don't know who you're dealing with." Behind him, one of his men let out a derisive laugh, his posture casual as he leaned lazily against the wall, his arms crossed. "Yeah, lady," he sneered, his tone mocking. "You should probably figure that out before you get yourself in trouble." Claire didn't flinch, her calm gaze locked on Red, ignoring the man behind him as if he hadn't spoken at all. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she said, her voice even, almost eerily calm in the face of their growing hostility. "And I've already told you, you're not welcome here." Red tilted his head slightly, his grin returning, but darker now, more dangerous. "Oh, we're not welcome," he said, his tone mockingly sweet, the sarcasm laced with malice. "Well, that's just rude. And here we are, trying to be neighborly." His companion near the tables dragged a chair out with deliberate slowness, the screech of wood against the floor echoing harshly in the tense silence. He plopped down into it with a smug grin, leaning back as if he owned the place, his arms crossed lazily over his chest, his eyes scanning the room with a mocking indifference that made the hairs on the back of Claire's neck stand on end. "You'd think she'd be a little more grateful," he drawled, his tone dripping with fake concern. "This place looks like it could use some protection." Claire's hand rested lightly on the edge of the counter, her posture calm, though every muscle in her body was coiled like a spring. Her fingers remained steady but ready, her instincts sharp as ever. "My cafe is fine without your kind of protection," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a razor. Red let out a laugh, loud and sharp, the sound jarring in the uneasy quiet. "That's what they all say at first," he said, his grin widening as his gaze swept the room. "But trust me, lady, everyone changes their tune once reality sets in." He gestured broadly with one hand, his voice growing louder, the feigned charm in his tone doing little to mask the menace beneath. "You see, places like this, they don't last long without friends. Accidents happen. Windows break. Fires start. It's just the way things are." His words hung in the air like thick smoke, choking the warmth out of the cafe. Claire's remaining customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their unease palpable. Mrs. Gupta clutched her handbag even tighter, her thin fingers trembling slightly as her wide eyes darted nervously toward the door, as though weighing whether it was safe to make a quiet exit. "I think you've overstayed your welcome," Claire said firmly, her voice low but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Each word was sharp and deliberate, leaving no room for doubt. One of Red's men, still lounging near the tables, scoffed loudly, shaking his head as he leaned farther back in his chair. "She really thinks she's in charge here, huh?" he sneered, his grin widening as he exchanged glances with his companions. "That's adorable." Red took a slow, deliberate step closer to the counter, his movements calculated, his grin fading into something colder, more deliberate. He reached out, his fingers brushing against a ceramic mug sitting neatly on the counter. Lifting it casually, he turned it over in his hands, inspecting it like it was some trinket he'd stumbled upon. His eyes flicked up to meet Claire's, his grin returning, though now it carried a darker edge. "Nice little place you got here," he said softly, almost a whisper, though the menace in his tone made it impossible to miss. "Shame if something happened to it." Without warning, Red released the mug, letting it slip from his hand and crash onto the floor. The sharp crack of breaking ceramic echoed through the cafe like a gunshot, cutting through the thick silence and making everyone in the room flinch involuntarily. Pieces of the shattered mug scattered across the floor, a stark contrast to the usually pristine and orderly space. Mrs. Gupta gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock as she clutched her handbag even tighter. The young couple near the corner tensed visibly, their bodies stiff, their hands gripping the edge of their table as if it could somehow anchor them against the rising tension in the room. Claire didn't so much as blink. She remained motionless, her gaze locked on Red with an intensity that carried both calm authority and unflinching resolve. Her expression betrayed nothing, no fear, no anger, only the quiet strength that had always defined her. "You're going to clean that up," she said, her voice low and steady, each word deliberate and cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. Red raised an eyebrow, a look of mock surprise crossing his face as his lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, am I?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "And what if I don't?" Claire stepped forward slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate, her posture straight and commanding. "Then you're going to leave," she said simply, her tone even and matter-of-fact, as though there was no other possibility. For a moment, the room was completely still, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then the man lounging at the table let out a laugh, a harsh, grating sound that filled the cafe and seemed to mock the very idea of order. "You hear that, Red? She thinks she's calling the shots." Red's smirk returned, sharper now, edged with a malice that made the air feel colder. His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, his presence looming. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "I don't think you get how this works. This isn't your place anymore. Not unless we say it is." He turned toward the customers, gesturing at them with a sweeping motion, as though they were nothing more than props in a scene he controlled. "Look at them," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the thick silence of the cafe. "All quiet, all scared. You really think any of them are going to step in, call for help? They're not going to do a damn thing. They're just going to sit there, sipping their coffee, hoping we leave them alone." Claire's fingers curled into fists at her sides, the tension in her body coiled and ready, but she forced herself to stay calm. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her sharp gaze flicking briefly toward the faces of her customers. Mrs. Gupta sat frozen, her hands trembling as she gripped her handbag like it was a lifeline. The young couple in the corner held each other's hands tightly, their faces pale with worry. Near the window, the older man stared into his coffee, his shoulders hunched as though trying to make himself smaller. They were scared, yes, but in their eyes, Claire saw something else, something that steadied her. "Trust." "You're wrong," Claire said, her voice calm but unyielding, each word deliberate and firm. "This is my cafe, and if you think you can walk in here and intimidate people, you're mistaken." Red's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, a crack in his carefully maintained facade. But he quickly recovered, his grin returning, sharper now, more calculating. "Big talk," he sneered, taking another deliberate step closer to her, closing the distance between them. "Let's see if you've got anything to back it up." The man sitting at the table stood suddenly, shoving his chair back with a loud scrape that seemed to reverberate through the tense air. "Red, come on," he said, his tone eager, almost gleeful. "Let's show her what happens when people don't play along." Red raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace, his piercing gaze never leaving Claire's face. "I want to hear her say it again. Tell me we're not welcome. Go on, say it." Claire's heart pounded in her chest like a drum, but her voice remained steady, her resolve unwavering. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression hard as steel. "You're not welcome here," she said, her tone firm and unshaken, like a fortress refusing to bow to a storm. Red's smirk twisted into a snarl, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Fine," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "Have it your way." He turned to his men, his body tense with barely restrained aggression. "Let's show her what happens when people don't know their place." His eyes darted back to Claire, his expression dark and threatening. He pointed at her with deliberate precision, his words cutting like a blade. "Put her in her place," he ordered, his voice low and dripping with malice, the finality of his command sending a shiver through the room. One of Red's men, a wiry figure with tattoos snaking up his neck and an unsettling grin plastered across his face, took a step toward her. His movements were slow, deliberate, and predatory, like a cat toying with its prey. "You've got a real big mouth, lady," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery and menace. Claire remained calm, her hands resting on the counter in plain sight, her posture steady despite the tension radiating through her body. Her muscles were coiled, ready to act at a moment's notice, but she didn't flinch or retreat. "Don't," she said simply, her tone low but unshakably firm, each word carrying quiet authority. The man ignored her warning, his grin widening as he reached out to grab her arm. His movements were quick, but Claire's reaction was faster. Instinct and training kicked in. She twisted her wrist free with precision, her hand snapping to his as she shifted her weight and stepped sideways. His momentum worked against him as she pulled him off balance, redirecting his force with practiced ease. In one fluid motion, she pushed him downward, forcing him to his knees without needing to strike him. "Stop!" Claire said, her voice sharp, commanding, and devoid of fear. The man groaned, clutching his wrist as he scrambled back, his expression shifting from smug to stunned. But the reprieve was brief. Red's furious snarl sliced through the air like a whip. "What the hell are you waiting for?" he barked, his voice rising. "Get her!" The man by the door surged forward, knocking over a chair in his rush toward her, the sharp clatter adding to the growing chaos in the room. His movements were clumsy and driven by brute force, but Claire sidestepped his first swing effortlessly, her sharp reflexes keeping her one step ahead. His arms sailed past her, and he stumbled slightly before spinning back to face her, rage contorting his features as he raised his fists again. Claire was already moving. She grabbed a ceramic tray from the counter, her grip firm as she swung it to intercept his next punch. The impact reverberated through the room, the sound sharp and jarring, silencing even the murmurs of the frightened onlookers. "Get out!" Claire shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade as the room erupted into a whirlwind of motion and noise. Her unwavering resolve stood tall against the storm brewing around her. The customers, frozen in shock for what felt like an eternity, suddenly snapped into motion. Chairs toppled over, tables screeched against the wooden floor, and the doorbell jangled frantically as they pushed through it, each person scrambling for the exit. Mrs. Gupta, clutching her handbag to her chest with trembling hands, was the last to leave. Her hand clamped tightly over her mouth as she turned back for one fleeting glance at Claire, her wide, tear-filled eyes a mix of fear and helplessness. Claire, however, didn't have the luxury to look back or acknowledge the fleeing crowd. The second gang member had joined the fray, charging toward her with uncoordinated but aggressive swings, his hands reaching out to grab her. She ducked beneath his grasp with practiced precision and shoved a chair into his path, sending him stumbling clumsily into the counter with a loud crash. "You think you can take us on?" one of them growled, his voice thick with frustration as he lunged at her from the side. Claire's eyes flicked to a broom leaning in the corner. Grabbing it swiftly, she raised it in a defensive stance, using the sturdy wooden handle to block his clumsy strike. In one sharp motion, she thrust the broom forward, jabbing it into his stomach. He doubled over with a grunt, coughing and clutching his abdomen as she discarded the broom, tossing it aside without hesitation. Red, standing a few feet away, watched the scene unfold with mounting irritation. His trademark smirk was beginning to falter, replaced by a scowl of disbelief as he barked at his men. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, his voice laced with fury. "Take her down!" The tattooed man, now red-faced and angrier than ever, staggered back to his feet. His eyes darted around the room until they landed on a glass sugar dispenser sitting on a nearby table. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and hurled it toward Claire. The glass sailed through the air, but Claire moved swiftly, sidestepping just in time. The dispenser shattered violently against the wall behind her, sending shards cascading to the floor. She grabbed a metal pitcher from the counter, gripping it tightly as another man lunged at her with outstretched arms. This time, his hands managed to grab her wrist, yanking her toward him with surprising force. But Claire was quicker. She pivoted sharply, twisting her arm free with a practiced motion before slamming the edge of the pitcher into his arm. The man howled in pain, stumbling back and clutching his now bruised limb. Red, his frustration boiling over, grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it toward her with all his strength. The chair flew across the room, but Claire moved just in time, the wooden frame smashing into a table instead. The loud, splintering crash echoed through the now empty cafe, a room left in chaos, littered with broken glass, scattered chairs, and overturned tables. "You're gonna pay for this," Red snarled, his voice low and venomous as he advanced toward her, each step deliberate and full of menace. His piercing gaze bore into Claire, his fury barely contained as he took in the wreckage of the cafe. Claire held her ground, her breathing steady despite the chaos that surrounded her. Her sharp eyes briefly flicked to the mess, the shattered mugs, broken glass, toppled chairs, and overturned tables, before locking back onto Red with unflinching resolve. She didn't waver, her body poised and ready to respond to any move he made. "Walk away," she said firmly, her voice calm but cutting through the noise like steel. Each word was deliberate, carrying a weight that demanded attention. Red's face twisted with rage, his lips curling into a snarl. "Not a chance," he spat, his tone seething with anger. He raised a hand, signaling to his remaining men to close in on her. The two gang members moved as one, rushing her with brutal intent. One swung a chair leg he had picked up like a crude club, the motion wide and clumsy but powerful, while the other darted behind her, his hands reaching out to grab her. Claire reacted instantly. She ducked low, using the counter as cover to evade the wild swing of the makeshift weapon. Her hand shot out, grabbing the coffee pot resting nearby. With a swift, decisive motion, she smashed it against the counter's edge. The pot shattered with a sharp, jarring crack, shards scattering across the counter and floor, momentarily freezing the man with the chair leg in place. She didn't hesitate. Using the split-second opening, Claire swept her leg out, catching him off balance and sending him sprawling to the ground. He hit the floor hard, a loud thud punctuating his fall, and he cursed loudly, clutching his knee in pain. The second man lunged at her again, his movements faster this time, but Claire was ready. She twisted out of his grip with practiced precision and drove her elbow into his ribs. The impact was solid, drawing a sharp gasp of pain from him as he staggered backward, clutching his side, and crashed into one of the tables, knocking it over. Red stood back, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might crack. His fists were balled at his sides, the veins in his neck bulging as his anger boiled over. "You think you're tough?" he growled, his voice low and threatening, almost a hiss. "You think this is over?" Claire adjusted her stance, her feet firmly planted, her muscles tense but controlled. Her eyes locked onto Red with unwavering determination, her voice cold and steady as she spoke. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, the words cutting through the chaos like a blade. Red's lips curled into a sneer, the malice in his expression deepening. For a moment, he didn't move, his calculating gaze fixed on her as though measuring her resolve. Then, with a sharp motion, he gestured to his men, his voice low but dripping with venom. "Get up! This isn't over!" The gang began to regroup, their confidence visibly shaken, but the anger in their eyes still burned fiercely. They moved with less swagger now, their bravado tempered by the sting of their earlier failures, but their aggression remained intact. Claire tightened her grip on the broken handle of the pitcher still in her hand, her knuckles white from the force. Her breathing was heavy, but her focus remained razor-sharp. The cafe, once warm and inviting, now resembled a war zone. Overturned chairs and splintered wood littered the floor, shards of glass scattered everywhere. The sharp, acrid smell of sweat and the faint metallic tang of blood mixed with the aroma of coffee that still lingered faintly in the air. Claire's sharp eyes darted between the men, her body coiled like a spring, ready for their next move. Red clenched his fists tightly at his sides, his jaw set as his frustration simmered. He glared at his men, his voice rising to a furious bark. "What are you waiting for? Take her down!" One of the men, still clutching the chair leg like a makeshift weapon, lunged at her with renewed determination. His swings were wild and erratic, driven more by anger than precision. Claire sidestepped the first strike with ease, her movements quick and calculated, but the second swing grazed her arm. A sharp jolt of pain shot down her side, and she hissed through her teeth, her expression tightening for a brief moment. She didn't falter. As he prepared for another swing, she dropped low, using his momentum against him. With a forceful drive, she shoved her shoulder into his chest, her movement precise and deliberate. He stumbled backward, his balance lost, and crashed into a table with a loud thud, the sound reverberating through the tension-filled cafe. Another man darted in from her blind spot, moving fast enough to catch her off guard. His fist struck her shoulder in a glancing blow, sending her stumbling a step back. Claire gritted her teeth, the sharp ache radiating through her arm, but she quickly regained her footing, her mind calculating her next move. Her eyes darted to the metal tray she'd dropped earlier in the chaos. With a swift motion, she grabbed it off the floor and swung it upward in a smooth, arcing strike. The edge of the tray caught the man squarely under the chin with a sharp clang. He staggered backward, his hands flying to his face as he let out a string of curses, blood beginning to trickle from a split in his lip. "Not so tough now, are you?" Red snarled, his voice dripping with contempt as he stepped forward. His eyes glinted with malice as his hand grabbed a glass jar of coffee beans sitting on the counter. Without hesitation, he hurled it at her with all his strength. Claire barely had time to react. She raised her arm instinctively, deflecting the brunt of the impact, but shards of glass exploded outward, slicing across her exposed forearm. She winced, a sharp sting radiating from the fresh wound, but she didn't let herself falter. Her hand went instinctively to the injury, her fingers pressing against it to slow the bleeding. But her focus never wavered. The gang's movements were growing increasingly chaotic now, their frustration overtaking their coordination. They swung wildly, their aggression sloppy and untamed. Claire saw her opportunity and exploited it, keeping her own movements controlled and deliberate. When one man charged at her, his steps heavy and clumsy, she kicked a nearby chair into his path. The legs of the chair tangled with his, and he went down hard, crashing into a pile of broken furniture with a loud, satisfying thud. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Red growled, his voice low and venomous. His fury was evident in every movement as he grabbed another chair, hefting it with both hands. With a guttural shout, he swung it toward her with all his strength, the wooden legs slicing through the air. Claire ducked just in time, the chair sailing inches over her head before smashing into a nearby table, splintering the wood with a deafening crack. She didn't hesitate, her body reacting with the precision of muscle memory. She pivoted and delivered a sharp kick to his knee, the force making him stumble back with a grunt. Before he could recover, her hand darted to the counter, grabbing a heavy coffee grinder. With a quick, decisive motion, she swung it into his side, the weight of the grinder driving a pained grunt from him as he doubled over. One of his men lunged at her from the side, his hand clamping down on her wrist in an attempt to restrain her. The grip was strong, but Claire twisted sharply, her movements fluid and precise, breaking free with ease. Before he could react, she delivered a quick jab to his throat with the heel of her hand. The strike was efficient and devastating, leaving him gagging as he stumbled backward, clutching at his neck, his breath coming in shallow, pained gasps. Red's patience finally snapped. "Enough!" he roared, his voice booming and filled with rage, the command cutting through the tension like a whip. He threw up his hands to stop his men, who froze mid-motion, their bodies battered and their confidence clearly shaken. His face was flushed with anger, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The cut on his lip was bleeding steadily now, a thin trail of crimson running down his chin, but he didn't seem to notice or care. His furious gaze locked onto Claire, his eyes blazing with an intensity that threatened to scorch everything in its path. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice low and venomous, each word laced with barely contained fury. He wiped the back of his hand roughly across his mouth, smearing the blood but doing little to hide his injuries. "You've got no idea what you've just done." Claire stood her ground, her breathing steady despite the chaos that had unfolded around her. The sharp sting from the cut on her forearm throbbed in time with her pulse, and her shoulder ached where the chair leg had struck her earlier. But she refused to let the pain show. Her resolve was unshaken as she met Red's glare head-on, her expression calm but unyielding. "You're not welcome here," she said firmly, her voice steady and deliberate, the words carrying the weight of finality despite the adrenaline still surging through her veins. Red sneered, the corner of his mouth twitching with contempt as he wiped his bloodied hand against his pants. "We'll see about that," he growled, his tone low and threatening. He turned to his men, who were groaning and limping, their battered forms a testament to the fight they hadn't been prepared for. "Let's go," he barked, his frustration evident as he motioned for them to follow him. The gang retreated slowly, their footsteps heavy and uneven as they shuffled toward the door. Each man cast a glance back at Claire, their expressions a mix of anger, humiliation, and barely concealed fear. Red, however, paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the door as he turned back to face her one last time. His voice was quiet now, almost a whisper, but the menace in his tone was unmistakable. It carried across the wreckage of the cafe like a blade, cutting through the silence left in their wake. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You've got no idea what's coming." With that, he pushed the door open, the faint jangle of the bells sounding almost eerie in the now empty cafe. The gang disappeared into the street, leaving behind a scene of chaos and destruction. And Claire, standing amidst it all, unbroken. Claire exhaled shakily, her grip finally loosening on the tray she had been clutching so tightly. It slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, the sharp sound echoing in the now eerily silent cafe. She leaned heavily against the counter for a moment, her body feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. Her muscles ached, her arm throbbed, and the adrenaline that had been driving her began to ebb away, leaving behind exhaustion and pain. The room was deathly quiet, save for the faint creak of a chair rocking unsteadily on a broken leg. The chaotic scene around her seemed frozen in time. An overturned table here, shattered glass glittering on the floor there, a faint smear of coffee pooling near the counter. Claire glanced down at her arm, where blood still trickled from the cuts the shattered glass had left behind, staining the fabric of her sleeve and slowly dripping onto the floor. She didn't bother to tend to it yet. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the door where Red and his gang had disappeared moments earlier. His parting words played on a loop in her mind, the warning heavy with menace. This isn't over. She knew those weren't idle words. There would be more. There was always more. Claire stood still in the center of her cafe, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. The silence pressed heavily against her ears, amplifying the dull ache in her shoulder and the sting of her arm. Her gaze swept the room slowly, taking in the full extent of the damage. It wasn't just the physical destruction. The overturned chairs, the splintered tables, the shards of broken glass scattered across the floor. It was the sense of violation, of something precious being tainted, the lingering scent of spilled coffee mixed with the metallic tang of blood, sharp and unwelcome. She swiped a hand across her brow, wiping away a faint trace of sweat and dirt, leaving a smudge on her cheek. Her breathing steadied, but her thoughts were far from calm. Her cafe had always been a sanctuary, a safe haven for the community. Now, it felt different. Its peace fractured, its warmth dimmed, but Claire was not one to wallow. She pushed off the counter and grabbed the broom from its corner, the familiar weight of it grounding her. She began sweeping up the shattered glass, each scrape of the broom against the floor grating on her nerves. The methodical movement gave her a moment to think, to process what had just happened. Her eyes caught on the scattered pieces of a broken mug near the counter. She crouched to pick up the larger shards, her hands working with quiet determination. The dented coffee grinder and the toppled sugar dispensers were more than just damaged objects. They were symbols of what her cafe stood for, and what she would fight to protect. This wasn't the end. Red's gang had left her shaken, but not broken. Damage could be repaired. What mattered now was what came next. Her gaze drifted to the photo of Lila on the counter, sitting miraculously untouched amidst the chaos. Claire reached for it, her fingers brushing lightly against the smooth glass of the frame. Lila's radiant smile beamed up at her, carefree and full of life, her curls bouncing in the wind. The photo seemed to stand in stark contrast to the wreckage surrounding her, a beacon of everything Claire was fighting to protect. That was what mattered most. The faint jingle of the doorbell broke the stillness as Claire propped it open to let in some fresh air. A soft breeze carried in the fading scents of the evening, but it did little to dispel the heaviness in the air. She stepped outside briefly, her sharp eyes scanning the quiet street. The world seemed almost unnaturally calm after the storm that had torn through her cafe, but something felt off. Her gaze landed on a black car parked across the street, its dark-tinted windows reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. It hadn't been there earlier. The engine was silent, and no one got out. Claire's chest tightened as unease prickled at her instincts. She turned back toward the cafe, forcing herself to focus on the immediate tasks at hand. She didn't want to overreact, but she didn't believe in coincidences either. Later that evening, Claire pulled her truck into the driveway of her small home on the outskirts of town. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of purple and blue. The faint hum of buzzing streetlights filled the air as she stepped out of the vehicle. Her sharp eyes flicked toward the tree line at the end of the block, her senses heightened. A subtle flicker of movement caught her attention. A car eased slowly around the corner, its headlights slicing through the growing darkness. It slowed as it passed her house, the beams briefly illuminating her truck, and the front porch before the vehicle picked up speed again, disappearing into the night. Claire stood still, watching until the car was completely out of sight, her jaw tightening. She didn't need confirmation to know. This wasn't over. Her fingers twitched with the urge to grab her phone, but she hesitated, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. It could be nothing. Just a passing car. A coincidence. Yet, the tightness in her chest refused to ease, her instincts buzzing with a warning she couldn't shake. Years of training had taught her to trust that feeling, and right now, it told her to stay vigilant. Inside the house, Lila was sprawled on the living room floor, her crayons scattered across the carpet as she worked on a drawing. The soft sound of her humming filled the space, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling in Claire's mind. Lila looked up with a bright smile as Claire stepped into the room. "Mom, look at this one," she said excitedly, holding up a colorful picture of a sunlit meadow filled with flowers. Claire forced a smile, crouching down beside her. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm but slightly distracted. "You're getting really good at coloring." Lila's grin widened as she returned to her drawing, humming softly to herself. Claire reached out, her hand gently smoothing over her daughter's curls, the soft texture grounding her for a moment. Her heart felt heavy, the weight of her worry pressing down. Lila was her whole world, the one thing that kept her moving forward. The thought of anything, or anyone, threatening that world made her blood run cold. Claire straightened, her eyes flicking toward the living room window. She moved to it quietly, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The street outside was calm and still, the faint glow of a streetlight casting long shadows on the pavement. Everything seemed normal, but it didn't feel normal. She scanned the parked cars, the shadowed corners, her sharp eyes searching for any hint of movement. Her phone buzzed on the counter, the sound startling in the quiet. She grabbed it instinctively, her heart skipping a beat. It was a text from her sister, Ellen. "How's my favorite niece?" Claire stared at the message for a moment, her thoughts churning before she typed back, "She's great. Can we talk tomorrow? Something's come up." As soon as the message sent, she set the phone down, her jaw tightening as her resolve hardened. Tomorrow, she'd make a plan. She couldn't ignore the unease, and she wouldn't wait for the next move. Her gaze shifted back to the window, her faint reflection staring back at her in the glass. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions, but she also wouldn't ignore the signs. If someone was watching her, if they were watching her, she'd make sure they never got close enough to harm what mattered most. Lila's safety was non-negotiable, and Claire would do whatever it took to ensure that her world remained intact. The next morning, Claire sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee that she hadn't taken a single sip from. The rich aroma filled the air, but the cup had long since grown cold. The house was calm, sunlight streaming through the curtains in soft, golden streaks that painted the walls. From the living room, Lila's cheerful humming drifted in as she played with her crayons, the soft sound tugging at Claire's heart. Blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them, Lila's world remained unshaken, untouched by the tension that weighed heavily on her mother. Claire's eyes dropped to her phone on the table. Ellen's name already pulled up on the screen. The thought of sending Lila away, even for a few days, filled her with dread. But after the attack at the cafe, and the unsettling presence of the car outside her house the night before, she knew she couldn't afford to take any chances. Protecting Lila was her top priority, even if it meant temporary separation. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Claire pressed the call button. Ellen picked up after only a couple of rings. "Hey, Claire! How are you?" Ellen's voice was light and cheerful, its warmth offering a small comfort in the midst of Claire's unease. "I'm okay," Claire replied, though the tightness in her tone betrayed her. Her fingers tapped lightly against the mug as she searched for the right words. "Ellen, I need to ask you for a favor." "Of course," Ellen said immediately, her tone shifting to one of concern. "What's going on?" "I need you to take Lila for a few days," Claire said carefully, keeping her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. It's nothing to worry about. I've just got a lot going on with the cafe, and I need some time to focus on sorting it all out. I think it'll be better for her to stay with you for a little while." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Is everything okay?" Ellen asked, her voice soft but probing, concern evident in her tone. "It's fine," Claire replied quickly, her voice light but firm, doing her best to sound convincing. "Just a lot of grown-up stuff she doesn't need to be around for right now." Ellen hesitated, the silence hanging for a moment, but she didn't press further. "Okay," she said finally, her voice reassuring. "Bring her over whenever you're ready. You know she's always welcome here." "Thank you," Claire said, her voice soft, the weight of her gratitude apparent. "I'll bring her by this afternoon." She ended the call, exhaling slowly as she set the phone back on the table. For now, she had a plan. That afternoon, Claire pulled her truck to a stop in front of Ellen's house, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Beside her on the passenger seat sat Lila's small duffel bag, neatly packed with all the essentials: her favorite pajamas, her toothbrush, and the stuffed bunny she couldn't sleep without. In the back seat, Lila chattered excitedly, her voice full of the boundless energy and innocence that Claire was determined to protect. "Aunt Ellen said she has snacks," Lila announced with a wide grin, her bunny clutched tightly in her small hands, as though it were her greatest treasure. Claire glanced at her daughter in the rearview mirror and mustered a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sure she does," she said softly. "You're going to have a great time with her." As they stepped out of the truck and approached the house, Ellen was already waiting for them on the porch. Her smile was warm and welcoming, but her eyes flicked to Claire's face, scanning it with quiet concern. Ellen had always been able to read her, and Claire knew her sister could sense the tension she was trying to keep buried. "There's my favorite niece," Ellen said brightly, crouching down to greet Lila. "Come here, kiddo." Lila giggled as she ran into her aunt's open arms, her laughter ringing out like a balm to the unease Claire couldn't quite shake. Ellen scooped her up, spinning her around before holding her close. Claire reached for the duffel bag, handing it over with a grip that lingered just a moment too long. "I'll call every day to check in," she said, her voice steady but tinged with softness, as though trying to reassure herself as much as anyone else. Ellen gave a small nod, her tone gentle but firm. "She'll be fine, Claire. You focus on what you need to do." Lila turned toward her mother, her expression bright but tinged with curiosity. "Mommy, you'll come back soon, right?" Claire crouched down to her daughter's level, brushing a soft curl away from her face. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm and soothing despite the heaviness in her chest. "It's just for a few days. I promise I'll come get you before you even have time to miss me." Lila smiled brightly, her trust in her mother unshakable, and Claire felt the weight of her responsibility settle even more firmly on her shoulders. Lila nodded, satisfied with her mother's answer, and threw her small arms around Claire's neck. "Okay, Mommy. Love you," she said, her voice muffled against Claire's shoulder as she hugged her tightly. "I love you too," Claire whispered, her voice soft but filled with emotion. She held her daughter close, the moment stretching just a little longer, as she let herself soak in the warmth and innocence of Lila's embrace. Finally, she stood, gently releasing her. Claire's eyes followed as Ellen took Lila's hand and led her inside. Lila turned back to wave one last time, her stuffed bunny clutched under one arm, her bright smile lighting up the dim evening. Claire forced herself to wave back, her lips curving into a small, reassuring smile. When the door finally closed behind them, she lingered on the porch for a moment, her heart heavy and her mind racing with plans. With a deep breath, she turned and walked back to her truck, each step feeling heavier than the last. Later that evening, Claire sat in her truck in the driveway, the faint hum of crickets in the background as she stared at her phone. Her fingers hovered for a moment before she pressed the call button, holding the phone to her ear as she waited for Detective Javier Reyes to pick up. "Matthews," came Reyes's brisk voice, cutting through the quiet. "I need your help," Claire said, skipping any pleasantries and cutting straight to the point. Her voice was steady, but the underlying urgency was unmistakable. "That gang, Red Carter and his men, They attacked my cafe. What? Reyes's voice immediately sharpened with concern. Are you okay? I'm fine, Claire replied, her tone firm but clipped, as though trying to move past the question quickly. But they're not done. They've been watching me. I saw a car parked outside my house last night. I need to know what I'm dealing with. Reyes sighed, the faint rustle of papers audible on the other end. Red's been on our radar for years. Extortion, intimidation, hate crimes. You name it, he's done it. But we've never had enough to put him away. No one's willing to testify, and his crew covers their tracks too well. Well, I'm not afraid of them, Claire said, her voice hardening with resolve. I'm not going to let them get away with this. Look, I get it, Reyes said, his voice measured but firm. But you need to be smart about this. These guys don't play fair, Claire, and they won't hesitate to escalate if they think you're a threat. They started this, Claire replied, her tone as cold as steel. But I'm going to finish it. There was a pause on the line, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Reyes exhaled audibly, his hesitation evident. All right, he said finally, his voice more subdued. I'll dig into their records, see what I can find. If they've slipped up anywhere, I'll catch it. In the meantime, watch your back. And Claire? Yeah? She said, her grip tightening slightly on the phone. Call me if anything happens, Reyes said, his tone more personal now. Don't try to handle this alone. Promise me that. Claire nodded out of habit, even though he couldn't see it. Thanks, Reyes, she said softly before ending the call. She leaned back in her seat, the faint hum of the truck's engine fading into the background as her eyes fixed on the darkened street outside. Her thoughts drifted to Lila, safe at Ellen's house for now. It was the only thing that gave her a sense of peace amid the chaos. Her daughter's safety was her anchor, the thing that kept her focused, even as the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her shoulders. Whatever was coming, she told herself, she'd be ready for it. The graffiti was the first thing Claire noticed when she returned to the cafe the next morning. It stretched boldly across the front window in jagged red letters. We don't forget. She stood still for a moment, her jaw tightening as she stared at the crude message. The letters were hurriedly sprayed, uneven and dripping in places, but their meaning was unmistakable. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a warning. A blatant reminder that Red and his crew weren't finished with her. Her boots crunched over broken glass as she stepped closer to inspect the damage. The window had been shattered, shards scattered across the sidewalk like tiny daggers catching the morning sunlight. The jagged remnants of the glass clung to the frame, sharp edges glinting like knives, reflecting the light in a way that seemed to mock her resolve. She inhaled deeply, her hands curling into fists at her sides. This was their way of trying to shake her, to make her feel powerless. But as she stared at the wreckage of her cafe, all it did was solidify her determination. They wanted her to break. But Claire Matthews didn't break. She took a deep breath, inhaling deeply as she forced herself to stay calm. The gang wanted her scared, rattled, paralyzed by fear. But Claire Matthews wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. She clenched her jaw, steadying herself as the weight of their threats pressed against her resolve. Later that afternoon, Claire stood in her driveway, staring at her truck with a mixture of frustration and determination. The windshield was splintered, the once clear glass now webbed with jagged fractures that caught the sunlight in harsh, uneven patterns. Resting on the hood of the truck was the culprit, a rock, large and rough, its surface flecked with dirt. Taped to it was a note, its edges flapping faintly in the gentle breeze. She stepped closer, tearing the note free with sharp, deliberate movements. Her fingers tightened around the paper as her eyes scanned the hastily scrawled words. Leave town or else. Claire's grip on the note tightened until the paper crumpled into a ball in her fist. Her gaze swept the street, her sharp eyes searching for any sign of movement. The neighborhood was eerily quiet. Too quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if eyes were lurking in the shadows, just beyond her line of sight, waiting for her to react. Her thoughts raced as she stood there, the cool breeze brushing against her face. Sending Lila to stay with Ellen had been the right choice. That much was clear. Knowing her daughter was safe brought her a small measure of relief. But this escalation in their intimidation tactics made it clear that Red and his men weren't just trying to scare her. They were trying to break her. That evening, Claire began to prepare. Her garage, usually cluttered with dusty tools and gardening equipment, became a makeshift armory. She retrieved a heavy lockbox from a high shelf, the metal cool and familiar beneath her fingers. Opening it, she stared at the items inside, relics from a life she had left behind but never truly forgotten. She pulled out a tactical flashlight, its weight familiar in her palm, followed by a combat knife with a blade she instinctively checked for sharpness. Finally, she grabbed a compact emergency first aid kit, tucking it into the pile of items she was assembling. Each object felt like an extension of herself, grounding her as she moved methodically. From her bedroom closet, Claire retrieved a sturdy duffel bag. She filled it with essentials, a change of clothes, bottled water, and additional supplies she might need if things escalated further. Every motion was deliberate, her focus sharp. If they wanted a fight, they'd chosen the wrong person. She moved to the windows, her focus razor-sharp as she reinforced them with extra locks she had stored in the garage. Each lock clicked into place with a satisfying finality. Next, she cut small wooden dowels to fit snugly into the tracks of the windows, wedging them in tightly to prevent them from being forced open. Every movement was methodical, deliberate, and precise. Her Navy SEAL training took over, muscle memory guiding her as though she had never left that life behind. But securing her home wasn't enough. Claire knew that physical preparation had to be paired with mental readiness. After finishing the windows, she stepped into the backyard as the late afternoon light began to fade, the golden hues of the setting sun casting long shadows across the grass. She spent the next hour running through combat drills, her muscles burning as she shadowboxed and practiced evasive maneuvers. It had been years since she'd needed to rely on these skills, but her body remembered. Her movements were slower than they had been in her prime, but they were still sharp and deliberate, each motion flowing into the next with precision. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire returned inside, her breathing steady but her senses heightened, her mind sharp and alert. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her thoughts racing as she replayed her drills in her head, assessing where she could be faster, where she could refine her movements. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her attention. The screen lit up with a call from Detective Reyes. She grabbed it without hesitation. "Matthews," Reyes said, skipping pleasantries, his tone brisk and serious. "I've been digging into Carter and his crew. You were right. They're targeting you because they think they can break you. It's their MO. Intimidation. Escalating violence. They've done this to other small businesses, usually minority-owned." Claire's grip on the phone tightened. "And what happened to those businesses?" she asked, her voice low and steady, though tension simmered beneath the surface. "Most folded," Reyes admitted grimly. "The owners either left town or paid them off. But a couple of cases," he paused briefly before continuing, "they turned violent. One owner was beaten so badly they were in the hospital for weeks. Another had their business burned to the ground." Claire's grip tightened on the phone. "And you haven't been able to stop them?" "We've tried," Reyes said, his frustration clear. "But no one will testify. Everyone's too scared. Carter makes examples of anyone who stands up to him. That's why this has gone on for so long." "Well, I'm not scared," Claire said, her voice sharp with resolve. "That's what worries me," Reyes said. "Look, I'm pulling everything I can on them. Their movements, their associates, even financial records. If there's something we can use to take them down, I'll find it. But you need to be careful. They won't back off easily." Claire stared out the window at the dark street, her mind running through scenarios, strategies. "I can handle myself," she said. Reyes hesitated. "I don't doubt that. But remember, Claire, you're not alone in this. Call me if anything happens." "I mean it. I will," she said, though her mind was already elsewhere. That night, Claire sat in her living room. The lights dimmed and the house silent. Her body was tired, but her mind wouldn't let her rest. The gang wanted her to feel isolated, vulnerable, but they had underestimated her. She wasn't just a cafe owner. She wasn't someone who could be scared into submission. She was ready for whatever came next. The night air was still as Claire locked up the cafe, the metal padlock clicking into place. She glanced up at the dark street, the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional distant bark of a dog, the only sounds. Her truck sat parked a few steps away, its familiar silhouette offering a small sense of comfort. Sliding into the driver's seat, she adjusted her rearview mirror out of habit. Her eyes caught a car parked a short distance down the street. It was dark, its engine silent, but something about its presence set her on edge. As she pulled away, the car's headlights flickered on, and it began to follow. Claire's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her mind racing. She turned onto a side street, her eyes flicking to the mirror. The car matched her turn, maintaining its distance but never falling too far behind. Her instincts, honed from years of military training, told her this wasn't a coincidence. The second car appeared 2 blocks later, its headlights cutting through the darkness as it joined the pursuit. Claire exhaled sharply, her pulse quickening, but her focus narrowing. She turned again, leading them into a quieter part of town, where the streets narrowed and the lights grew sparse. The cars stayed with her, boxing her in as another set of headlights appeared ahead, blocking the road. Her truck slowed, forced to a crawl as the lead car angled itself to block her path entirely. The car behind her stopped as well, its engine rumbling as its occupants spilled out. 3 men stepped into the road, their movements casual but deliberate. One of them, a stocky figure with a scar cutting across his cheek, smirked as he approached her truck. "Evening, lady," he called, his voice carrying through the still night. Claire stayed still, her hand hovering near the tactical flashlight she'd stashed in the console. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The man with the scar grinned wider. "Just a chat," he said, spreading his arms. "Red sends his regards. Said to make sure you're not causing any more trouble." Claire's heart pounded, but her expression didn't waver. She glanced around quickly, assessing her surroundings. The men were too confident, too careless. They didn't know who they were dealing with. The man reached for the truck door handle. "Let's not make this hard, huh?" Claire acted swiftly. She grabbed the flashlight, flipping it on and aiming it directly at his face. The beam blinded him, and he staggered back, cursing loudly. "Get her!" another man shouted, and the others rushed forward. Claire slammed the truck into reverse, her tires screeching as she backed toward the narrow gap between the 2 cars. One man leapt for the side of her truck, grabbing at the door, but she swerved sharply, sending him tumbling to the ground. The men gave chase, but Claire kept moving, her mind racing. She spotted a narrow alley up ahead and turned sharply into it, the confined space forcing the cars to slow down. One of the men, the one who had fallen, stumbled to his feet and ran to intercept her as she emerged from the alley. Claire braked just enough to avoid hitting him, then threw open the truck door, slamming it into his chest. He crumpled to the ground with a groan. Another man came at her with a crowbar, swinging it toward her windshield. Claire ducked low, grabbed the metal baton she kept beneath her seat, and swung it as she stepped out of the truck. The baton connected with his forearm, making him drop the crowbar with a howl. "Back off," Claire warned, her voice steady and cold. The men hesitated now, their confidence shaken. The one with the scar growled, "You're gonna regret this, lady." As he lunged toward her, Claire sidestepped his attack, twisting his arm behind his back and shoving him against the side of her truck. He cried out as she pressed the baton against his shoulder, her grip firm. "Stay down," she ordered, her tone like steel. The man didn't move, his groans the only sound as the others stumbled back toward their car. Claire climbed back into her truck and drove off, her chest heaving as she put distance between herself and the scene. Her arm ached from the scuffle, and a shallow cut on her hand stung, but she pushed the pain aside. When she was far enough away, she pulled into a quiet parking lot and grabbed her phone, dialing Reyes. "Matthews," Reyes answered, his voice alert. What's going on? They ambushed me, Claire said, her voice sharp but controlled. 3 of them. One's injured pretty badly. I left him near 8th and Pine. You might want to pick him up. Are you okay? Reyes asked quickly. I'm fine, Claire said. But this wasn't random. They mentioned Red. He sent them. Reyes cursed under his breath. All right, I'll get someone on it. If this guy's still there, we'll bring him in and see what we can get out of him. Claire's grip on the phone tightened. I want him to talk, Reyes. I need something I can use to take them down. I'll handle it, Reyes said. But you need to be careful, Claire. If Red's sending his guys after you, he's getting desperate. Desperate men are dangerous. Claire exhaled, her jaw clenching. So am I. The morning sun filtered through the blinds in Claire's kitchen as she stood at the counter, gripping a mug of coffee she had no intention of drinking. Her muscles ached from the night before, and the shallow cut on her hand had been hastily bandaged, but the pain barely registered. Her mind was focused elsewhere. Her phone buzzed, and she grabbed it immediately. It was Detective Reyes. We got him, Reyes said without preamble. The guy you left behind, he's in custody. Claire leaned against the counter, her grip tightening on the phone. Did he talk? Not much yet, Reyes admitted. But he's rattled. Enough for us to pull his prints and run him through the system. Turns out he's got priors, assault, extortion, even a weapons charge. He's not just a pawn, he's one of Red's main enforcers. That gives us leverage. Claire's jaw tightened. And what about Red? We're working on it, Reyes said. This guy, Eddie Morales, is tied to some of the crimes we've been trying to pin on Red's crew. If we can connect the dots, we might have enough to bring charges against him. But we need more. Claire frowned, pacing the small kitchen. What about the others? The guys who were with him last night. They fled before we got there, Reyes said. But Morales might give them up if we press hard enough. Right now, he's scared. He knows he messed up. Claire exhaled slowly, her mind racing. What's the plan, Reyes? Because waiting for them to make the next move isn't going to cut it. Reyes hesitated for a moment. We're putting the pressure on Morales. If we can get him to flip, he could lead us straight to Red. But Claire, you need to be ready. Red's not going to back down just because one of his guys is in custody. If anything, this will make him more aggressive. Good, Claire said, her voice cold. That means he'll make mistakes. Later that day, Reyes sat at his desk, sifting through files and reports. The walls of his office were lined with photos, maps, and notes about Red Carter's gang. A chaotic web of crime that spanned years. He stared at Morales' mugshot, his expression hardening. The man had refused to talk at first, but under the weight of evidence and the looming threat of a lengthy prison sentence, he'd started to crack. He's scared, one of Reyes' colleagues said, stepping into the room. Says Red's got eyes everywhere, that if he talks, he's done for. Reyes leaned back in his chair, considering. We don't need him to take the stand. We just need enough intel to set a trap. Get him to confirm Red's next move. The colleague nodded. He mentioned something about a big meeting. Something Red's planning to finish things. He wouldn't say much more, but it's a start. Reyes' eyes narrowed. A meeting, huh? Let's dig into that. If we can find out when and where, we'll have the upper hand. Meanwhile, Claire stood in her garage, methodically sharpening the edge of her combat knife. The rhythmic scrape of metal against the sharpening stone was almost meditative, her focus sharp and unwavering. Her phone buzzed, and she wiped her hands before picking it up. It was a message from Reyes. Call me. I have a lead. She called him immediately. What's the lead? Reyes' voice was firm but cautious. Morales mentioned something about a meeting. We're trying to confirm the details, but if it's real, this could be our chance to take them all down. Let me guess. You want to use me as bait, Claire said, her tone even. Reyes hesitated. You're the only one they want. They've made that clear. If we can get them to believe you're vulnerable, we can draw them out and corner them. Claire's grip on the phone tightened. What's the plan? We'll need to be smart about it, Reyes said. We'll set up a location, somewhere we control, with backup ready to move in. But we can't force them to come to us. They need to believe they're in control. Claire's mind was already racing, formulating her own strategies. Let me know when you have the location. I'll handle the rest. Claire, Reyes said, his voice softening slightly. This is dangerous. If they realize it's a trap, they won't hesitate to come after you. They already have, Claire said coldly. This time, I'll be ready. As night fell, Claire sat in the dimly lit living room, her mind a whirlwind of plans and contingencies. The gang thought they were the hunters, but they didn't realize they were walking into her territory now. Her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her cafe or her safety anymore. This was about justice. For her, for the community, and for everyone Red's gang had terrorized. Claire stood in the parking lot of an abandoned industrial warehouse on the outskirts of town, the wind cutting through her jacket. The building loomed large and empty, its windows broken, its walls scarred with years of neglect. It was the perfect place for what they were planning. Isolated, quiet, and with plenty of places to hide backup. Detective Reyes stepped out of his unmarked car, a file in hand. He approached her with a grim expression, glancing briefly at the warehouse. This is the spot. Red's crew won't be able to resist it. Secluded. No prying eyes. It'll make them think they've got the upper hand. Claire nodded, her eyes scanning the area. She could already see how it would play out. Red's men pulling up in their cars, believing they'd cornered her. They'd be wrong. Reyes handed her the file, his voice lowering. Morales finally gave us something solid. Red's planning a meeting to finish what was started. He's expecting you to be vulnerable, desperate. We're going to let him believe that. Claire opened the file and scanned the details, her jaw tightening as she read. You're sure they'll come? Reyes nodded. They will. Red's ego won't let him back down. He needs to prove he's in control. All we have to do is make him think he's setting the terms. Claire shut the file and handed it back. Good. Let's make sure he regrets it. Over the next 2 days, preparations began. Claire spent hours reinforcing the warehouse's interior. With Reyes's help, she set up motion sensors near the entrances and exits, rigged to alert them if anyone approached. Hidden cameras were installed to capture everything. Backup officers were stationed out of sight, ready to move in at a moment's notice. But Claire's focus wasn't just on the tactical side. In the quiet moments between planning, she found herself thinking about Lila. Sitting in the corner of the warehouse during a break, she pulled out her phone and opened her photo gallery. A picture of Lila, grinning ear to ear with her favorite stuffed bunny, filled the screen. Her thumb hovered over the image as a wave of emotion swelled in her chest. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about ensuring Lila could grow up in a town free from men like Red. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath to steady herself. When she opened them again, the resolve in her gaze was unshakable. That night, Claire prepared herself physically and mentally for the confrontation ahead. In her garage, she laid out her equipment: a tactical flashlight, her combat knife, and a small first aid kit. She checked each item carefully, her hands steady and methodical. Afterward, she spent an hour running through drills, her movements sharp and purposeful. She practiced disarming an attacker, neutralizing threats, and moving through confined spaces. Sweat dripped down her brow, but she didn't stop until her body moved with the same precision it had during her SEAL days. As she finished, Claire caught her reflection in the window of the garage door. She looked tired, yes, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't dimmed. She returned inside, where she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen. On the first page, she wrote a list. Short, deliberate. 1. Lure them in. 2. Isolate Red. 3. End this. She stared at the words for a long moment before flipping the notebook shut. The night before the trap was set, Claire made one final call to Ellen. Hey, Claire said, her voice softer than usual. Hey, Ellen replied. Everything okay? Yeah, Claire said. Just wanted to check in on Lila. She's doing great, Ellen said. She misses you, though. She made me promise to tell you she loves you. Claire smiled faintly, her heart aching with longing. Tell her I love her too. and I'll see her soon. You're sure you're okay?" Ellen pressed gently. "I will be," Claire said firmly. "Thanks for everything, Ellen." As she hung up, Claire leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The thought of Lila's smile was the fuel she needed to face what was coming. The following evening, Claire arrived at the warehouse early. Reyes was already there, briefing his team. "This is it," he said as she approached. "Once they step inside, we've got them. But remember, if they realize it's a trap too early, they'll scatter. Timing is everything." Claire nodded, her face calm but resolute. "I'll make sure they don't see it coming." Reyes glanced at her, a hint of concern in his eyes. "You don't have to do this alone, Claire. You've got backup." "I know," she said. "But this is personal." Reyes didn't argue. He simply handed her an earpiece. "We'll be listening. If anything goes sideways, we move in immediately." Claire slipped the earpiece into place, adjusting it before turning to face the warehouse. She stepped inside, the faint echo of her boots on the concrete floor the only sound. This was it. The stage was set. The warehouse was eerily quiet as Claire stood in the center of the cavernous space, her breathing steady but her senses sharp. The faint glow of the overhead lights reflected off the concrete floor, casting long, distorted shadows. Through her earpiece, Detective Reyes's voice came softly. "They're here. 3 cars just pulled up. 5 men confirmed, but Red isn't with them yet. Stay sharp." Claire didn't respond, her focus narrowing as she heard the faint rumble of engines outside. The sound stopped, followed by car doors slamming and muffled voices. Moments later, the main door creaked open, and the gang filed in cautiously. Scarface led the group, the crowbar resting casually on his shoulder as he scanned the room. His men fanned out behind him, their postures confident but predatory. Scarface smirked when his eyes landed on Claire. "Look at you, standing all alone in this big, empty warehouse. Red said you'd be here, but I didn't think you'd make it this easy for us." Claire didn't flinch, her voice calm but cold. "You think I'm alone?" Scarface chuckled, glancing around mockingly. "I don't see anyone else here. Just you and us. And trust me, you don't stand a chance." Scarface's words hung in the air for only a moment before one of his men rushed forward, a knife glinting in his hand. Claire sidestepped the attack, grabbing his wrist and twisting sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as she drove her elbow into his stomach, sending him staggering backward. Another man lunged at her with a chain, swinging it toward her head. Claire ducked low, grabbing a loose pipe from the floor and using it to deflect the chain. The clash of metal echoed through the space, and she followed up with a swift strike to his ribs, making him collapse with a groan. Scarface laughed, stepping forward. "Impressive, but you're just delaying the inevitable." He swung the crowbar with brute force, and Claire raised the pipe to block it. The impact reverberated up her arms, but she held firm. She shoved him back, her movements deliberate, but the others were already closing in. The fight devolved into chaos as Claire moved between the crates and beams, using the environment to outmaneuver the gang. She kicked a stack of loose boards into one man's path, sending him tumbling, and disarmed another by twisting his wrist and slamming his hand against a crate. But the gang wasn't slowing down. One of the men grabbed her from behind, locking his arm around her throat. Claire struggled, slamming her heel into his shin and elbowing him in the ribs. He released her with a grunt, but another man charged before she could fully recover. The man tackled her into a stack of crates, the rough edges scraping against her back. Claire cried out as pain flared through her ribs, the earlier blow from the crowbar making it harder to move. Her vision blurred briefly, and she forced herself to roll away, grabbing a heavy wrench as she stumbled to her feet. Scarface closed in, his crowbar swinging toward her side. She blocked it again, but the force of the strike sent her wrench flying out of her hand. Another man swung a pipe, catching her across the back. She fell to her knees, gasping as the pain seared through her. "Not so tough now, are you?" Scarface sneered, standing over her. Claire's grip tightened on the edge of the crate as she forced herself to rise, her body screaming in protest. "You're going to wish you'd stayed down," she said, her voice low and steady despite the pain. Scarface's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Take her out!" he barked to his men. The gang surged forward again, their confidence renewed. Claire fought with everything she had, using her training to anticipate their moves and counter their attacks. She swung a broken plank at one man, knocking him out cold, and threw a metal bucket at another, hitting him squarely in the face. But the odds were catching up to her. One man slammed her into a support beam, his hand tightening around her throat. Claire clawed at his arm, struggling to break free, when a sudden noise cut through the chaos. "Enough!" The gang froze, and Claire turned her head, her vision swimming, to see Red standing in the doorway. His silhouette was imposing, his face twisted in a cold smile as he stepped inside. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Matthews," Red said, his voice calm but venomous. "But it ends tonight." Scarface backed off immediately, his bravado fading in Red's presence. "We've got her. She's done for." Red glanced at Claire, his eyes narrowing. "She doesn't look done to me." He stepped closer, his boots echoing on the concrete. "You're still standing. That's the problem with you. You don't know when to quit." Claire staggered to her feet, blood trickling from her temple, her breathing labored. "You talk too much," she said, her voice hoarse but unyielding. Red's smirk widened as he cracked his knuckles. "Let's see how long you last without the theatrics." The warehouse felt like it was collapsing under the weight of the chaos. The gang encircled Claire once again, Red standing at the center with his cold, calculating smirk. Blood trickled down Claire's temple, and her breathing was labored, but she refused to back down. Her grip tightened on the broken pipe in her hand, the only weapon left within reach. "Last chance, Matthews," Red said, his voice low and venomous. "Drop that pipe, and maybe I'll let you crawl out of here." Claire wiped the blood from her face with the back of her hand, her jaw set. "You're right about one thing, Red. This ends tonight." Red's smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Have it your way." He motioned to his men, and they surged forward. Claire spun, using the pipe to deflect one man's swing while kicking another in the knee, sending him crashing to the ground. She ducked as another swung a length of chain, using the momentum to shove him into a support beam. But the fight was taking its toll. Her movements were slower now, each strike sending sharp pain through her bruised ribs. She stumbled back as Scarface lunged at her with the crowbar, barely managing to block the blow with the pipe. The impact sent shock waves up her arms, and she fell to one knee. Red watched, his arms crossed, his cold gaze fixed on her. "You're done, Matthews. Stay down." The distant wail of sirens pierced the night, faint but growing louder. Red's head snapped toward the sound, his expression darkening. "Damn it," he muttered, motioning to his men. "Wrap this up." "Now!" Claire used the moment of distraction to strike. She swung the pipe at Scarface, catching him in the ribs and knocking him into one of his comrades. The two collapsed in a heap as Claire staggered to her feet, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Red turned back to her, his fury barely contained. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" He lunged at her, fists swinging with brutal force. Claire dodged the first strike, but the second caught her in the shoulder, sending her stumbling into a crate. Red pressed forward, relentless, his punches heavy and wild. Claire gritted her teeth, her back against the crate as she blocked his next punch with her forearm. Summoning her remaining strength, she drove her knee into his stomach, forcing him to stumble back. She followed up with a swing of the pipe, aiming for his legs. But Red caught it mid-swing and yanked it from her grasp. Now, unarmed, Claire stepped back, her fists clenched as she squared off against him. Red grinned, twirling the pipe in his hands. "You're out of tricks, Matthews." "Not yet," Claire said, her voice steady despite the pain. The sound of tires screeching outside the warehouse echoed through the space, followed by the shouts of officers. Red froze, his eyes darting toward the commotion. Through the broken windows, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark interior. "Cops!" Scarface muttered, panic creeping into his voice. "Move!" Red barked at his men. "Out the back!" As the gang scattered, Reyes's voice crackled through Claire's earpiece. "We're inside. Officers are moving in. Hold your position." But Red wasn't running. He turned back to Claire, his face twisted with rage. "You think this changes anything? You think they can stop me?" Claire didn't answer. She stepped forward, her stance solid despite her injuries. "This is your last chance, Red. Give it up." He laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. "Not a chance." He lunged at her, swinging the pipe with brutal force. The final clash was brutal. Claire ducked under the first swing, her instincts sharp despite her exhaustion. She grabbed a broken plank from the ground and used it to deflect his next attack, the impact jarring her injured arm. Red pressed forward, each swing of the pipe forcing her back. Claire's vision blurred, but she focused on his movements, waiting for an opening. Finally, it came. Red swung wide, overextending, and Claire darted in, slamming the plank into his ribs with all the strength she had left. Red stumbled, dropping the pipe as he clutched his side. Claire didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, kicking the pipe out of reach and grabbing him by the collar. She twisted, slamming him into a stack of crates. "It's over, Red," she said, her voice low but filled with resolve. Red struggled, his breaths ragged as he glared at her. "You think you've won? You're nothing. You're just some desperate cafe owner who doesn't know when to quit." Claire tightened her grip, her face inches from his. "I'm not playing." Reyes and his team stormed into the warehouse, their weapons drawn. "Claire!" he shouted, his eyes scanning the scene. Claire stepped back, releasing Red as two officers moved in to cuff him. She stumbled slightly, catching herself on the edge of a crate. Reyes approached quickly, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "You okay?" he asked, his tone urgent. Claire nodded, though her body ached with every movement. "I'll live." Red struggled against the officers, shouting obscenities as they dragged him away. Claire watched him go, her chest rising and falling as the adrenaline began to fade. Reyes placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. Claire shook her head. "We did it." The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters the next morning, cameras flashing as news of the arrests spread through the town. Claire stood on the outskirts of the scene, watching as Detective Reyes addressed the press, detailing the gang's charges. Multiple counts of extortion, hate crimes, assault, and destruction of property. "Red Carter and his crew have been a menace to this town for years," Reyes said firmly. "Today, we're taking a stand. This community deserves to feel safe again, and this is just the beginning." Claire remained in the background, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. She didn't need the attention. Her satisfaction came from seeing Red and his men escorted out in cuffs, their arrogant postures gone, replaced by frustration and defeat. As Red passed her, flanked by officers, he locked eyes with Claire. His lip curled into a sneer, but there was a faint flicker of something else, fear. "You think this is over?" he growled, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You have no idea what's coming." Claire didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her voice calm and even. "It's over, Red. You've lost, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing it." For a moment, Red's composure cracked. His jaw tightened, and he turned away as the officers pushed him forward into the waiting transport van. Later that day, Reyes met Claire at the cafe, which was still boarded up and marked with evidence tape. He handed her a folder, his expression lighter than it had been in weeks. "It's all there," he said. "Testimonies, evidence, everything we need to make sure they don't walk." Claire flipped through the folder, scanning the reports and photos. "And the charges? Holding up," Reyes said. "With the hate crime enhancements, Red's looking at decades behind bars, if not life." Claire nodded, closing the folder. "Good. People need to know this isn't just about me. It's about all the families and businesses they've terrorized." "They will," Reyes said. "And you made that happen." She gave him a faint smile, but it didn't linger. "It's not about recognition, Reyes. I just want my daughter to grow up in a better place than this." "You've taken the first step," he said, his tone reassuring. "The rest will follow." The jailhouse was cold and sterile, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing faintly in the background. Claire sat at a small metal table, waiting as Red was escorted into the room. He was still in cuffs, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to his usual air of arrogance. He smirked as he sat down across from her. "I'm surprised you came. Here to gloat?" Claire leaned forward slightly, her hands folded calmly on the table. "No, I'm here to remind you of something." Red raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering slightly. "Oh, and what's that?" "That you've lost," Claire said simply. "You can't hurt anyone anymore. Not me. Not this town. Not anyone." Red's sneer returned, though it lacked its usual confidence. "You think I'll stay in here forever? People like me. We don't disappear. We adapt." Claire didn't blink, her tone remaining steady. "Adapt all you want. By the time you're out, the world will have moved on. You won't matter anymore." Red leaned back, his smirk fading entirely as her words hit their mark. For the first time, there was no retort, no bravado. Claire stood, pushing the chair back smoothly. "Enjoy your new reality, Red. It's the only one you have left." As she walked away, Red shouted something after her, but she didn't hear it. She didn't need to. The weight of his words, his threats, they were hollow now, powerless against the resolve she carried. The town began to recover in the weeks that followed. The cafe became a symbol of resilience, with community members gathering to help Claire repair the damage. The graffiti was scrubbed clean, the broken windows replaced, and the boarded-up door restored. More than just the cafe, the community itself began to heal. Families that had lived in fear for years started to reclaim their streets. Businesses reopened, children played in the parks, and a sense of safety returned. Claire watched it all quietly, her heart full, but her mind focused on the future. The fight wasn't over, not entirely, but it was a step in the right direction. The late afternoon sun bathed Ellen's cozy home in a golden glow. The smell of freshly baked cookies wafted from the kitchen, and laughter echoed faintly from the backyard where Lila played with Ellen's dog. Claire stood at the gate, her heart pounding as she watched her daughter run barefoot across the grass, her curls bouncing with each step. It felt like a lifetime had passed since she'd last held her, and now, as the weight of the past few weeks lifted, she felt her chest tighten with emotion. Ellen stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She spotted Claire and smiled warmly. Ellen called out, "Lila, someone's here to see you." Lila spun around, her face lighting up as she saw her mother standing by the gate. "Mommy!" she screamed, dropping the toy she was holding and running toward her. Claire crouched down just in time to catch Lila in her arms, holding her tightly as her daughter's small arms wrapped around her neck. The warmth of Lila's embrace melted every ounce of tension in Claire's body, and for the first time in weeks, she felt whole again. "I missed you, Mommy," Lila said, her voice muffled against Claire's shoulder. Claire kissed the top of her head, her voice breaking slightly as she whispered, "I missed you too, baby, so much." Lila pulled back slightly, her big brown eyes searching Claire's face. "Are you staying this time? No more grown-up stuff?" Claire smiled, brushing a curl out of Lila's face. "I'm staying. No more grown-up stuff, I promise." Later that evening, Claire and Lila sat on the porch swing, the warm breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers. Lila's head rested against her mother's shoulder as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Ellen said you were really busy fixing the cafe," Lila said, her voice soft and sleepy. "I was," Claire replied, her hand gently stroking Lila's hair. "But it's all better now. Everything's better." Lila tilted her head to look up at her. "Does that mean you'll make pancakes again? Aunt Ellen's are good, but yours are the best." Claire chuckled, a deep, genuine laugh that felt like a release. "Pancakes every morning, starting tomorrow." Lila grinned, snuggling closer. "Good." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Claire allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The battle was over. Red and his gang were behind bars. The town was healing, and the weight of fear that had loomed over her life was finally gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire felt a sense of peace, not just for herself, but for her daughter, her community, and the future she was building. She kissed Lila's forehead, her heart full as her daughter's breathing slowed into the steady rhythm of sleep. The darkness of the past few weeks no longer mattered. What mattered was this moment, this peace, this love, and the promise of brighter days ahead. The porch swing rocked gently as Claire held Lila close, watching the stars twinkle above. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.